Chapter 5. I ran along the narrow strip behind the fence, keeping low. The ground was uneven with roots and broken bricks shifting underfoot. I forced myself to place each step carefully rather than bolt blindly. A broken ankle at this point wouldn't help. I could still hear voices. Then a beam of light swept across the fence. I dropped flat and stayed still, the bundle of wet clothes pressed beneath me, the canvas bag trapped between my shoulder and the ground. The light passed over and went out. The voices went with it. I counted slowly to 10, then to 20. When I moved again, it was in the opposite direction. Coming across a gap in the fence, I eased myself through it, careful not to get snagged, and found myself in the overgrown strip that ran behind the neighboring gardens. There were no lights here, just weeds, old cans and bottles, the odd tire, and the dark shapes of boundary fences. I slogged along, wanting to put distance between myself and the house without breaking into open ground. Twice I stopped, but heard nothing to indicate pursuit. Reaching a disused service lane, I crossed it quickly and slipped into the shell of an abandoned garage block. I waited just beyond the threshold, letting my eyes adjust, listening for any sign I had been followed. Nothing came. Moving further inside, I put down the bundle and eased the bag from my shoulder. I crouched beside it, my breath finally beginning to settle. Margaret had got this bag ready for me. I opened it to find clothing first, folded tight, a pair of dark trousers, and a thick sweater, charcoal grey so I'd blend in with the night. Beneath them nestled underwear, including thermal socks. That was Margaret, my wife, so thoughtful. There was also a small towel, a bar of soap wrapped in paper, and a comb. Inside a small tin I found a handful of tablets, each in their own blister, pain relief, I assumed, along with a small tube of antiseptic cream and some plasters. Under the tin was a foil-wrapped package of thick sliced bread, a wedge of cheddar cheese, and an apple, plus a small bottle of water and a hip flask that I would keep for a treat. I had a feeling I was going to need it. At the very bottom of the bag lay a piece of paper. The writing was less deliberate this time, but still unmistakably Margaret's. Oak Lane Depot. Before first light Tuesday. Do not come back here. Trust C&L. Chew and swallow this note. It was signed M with a little heart emoji. I stared at it until the lettering blurred. Trust C&L. Not just Caroline, but Linda as well. They knew something I didn't. In fact, all three of them, my wife, my daughter, and my granddaughter, all knew a lot of things that I didn't. I started to feel as though I was running along behind my family, never quite catching up, never quite knowing what was going on. I folded the note and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Oak Lane Depot. I pictured the city as routes and allocations on a map. Oak Lane sat at the edge of the industrial quarter, close to the main roads, far enough from residential streets to avoid notice. A place things passed through. Before first light Tuesday. I stripped off my damp shirt and replaced it with a dry one, then pulled the sweater over my head. The warmth was comforting. I repacked the bag with the wet clothes in the bottom. Listening again, I could still hear no voices, no movement. Surely any pursuers would have given up by now. They would log what they had found and leave it at that. A vagrant in a shed. Not worth resources. I moved to the entrance and looked out. The service lane lay empty. Beyond it, the backs of warehouses formed a broken line against the sky. Oak Lane was about 3 miles from here. Close enough to reach on foot. Too far for complacency. I stepped out and walked down to where a wider road cut across my path. Beyond it, the industrial quarter began. I waited until a vehicle passed. It was not security. It was a delivery van, slow and unremarkable. I crossed the road, a man without identification, without a job, without a home, just another anonymous figure shambling into an indifferent industrial cityscape. Ronald Harker had disappeared. I kept to the edge of the road until I reached the first line of warehouses, then cut in between them, staying off the open stretch as long as I could. The ground here was broken concrete and oil-stained gravel. The air carried a stale industrial smell that clung to the back of my throat. I was just another uninteresting man walking aimlessly, head down, carrying a bag. No one paid me any attention. Oak Lane lay ahead and to the left. I did not go straight to it. Instead, I circled, using the side streets and service routes I remembered from years of site visits. The depot would not be visible from the main road. These places never were. They sat back from the street behind loading bays and fenced yards, their purpose disguised by the ordinary movement of goods. I slowed as I approached the boundary of the industrial quarter proper. A faded sign fixed to a low concrete wall announced Oak Lane Distribution. The lettering had been partially worn away. Further along that wall, the double gates stood open. As I watched, a vehicle rolled out, a flatbed carrying stacked crates secured under a tarpaulin. It was nothing unusual, with no markings beyond a standard allocation code stenciled on the side. The driver didn't look at me. As I came closer, I could see the yard was much wider than I'd expected. Several bays ran along the main building, doors half raised, men moving in and out with the steady rhythm of routine work. Forklifts trundled between marked lanes. Pallets were stacked in ordered rows. It was all entirely ordinary. That was the point. I walked past the entrance, not slowing, taking it in from the corner of my eye. There was no obvious perimeter security, no visible guards. It was just a functioning depot, operating as it always had. But there were details, a second line of fencing further in, set back from the main yard. It was higher, and topped with wire. That was not part of a standard distribution layout. And beyond that, partially obscured by the angle of the building, a row of vehicles that did not match the others. They were enclosed, with no company markings. I reached the end of the street and crossed the road before turning back. No one stopped me. No one asked for identification. Of course, I had no idea who might be surveilling me. At the end of the road I crossed again, walked back and entered the yard as if I belonged there. I neither hurried nor hesitated. Keeping my expression neutral, one hand on the strap of my bag, one in my pocket, I headed for the fencing at the back. Nothing changed. The usual activity went on around me. Then I heard it, a muffled cry, cut off almost as soon as it began. Without changing my pace or demeanor, I adjusted my course, angling towards where I thought the cry had originated. The men nearest me were focused on their tasks. No one was watching the perimeter. No one was watching me. I edged towards the inner fence and found a line of sight between stacked pallets. I stayed where I was long enough to be certain of what was going on. People were being brought forward in small groups. They were directed, names checked, counted, moved on. There was no hesitation, no resistance. The same rhythm I had seen in paperwork was now playing out in front of me. This was not where they ended up. This was where they passed through. I shifted position enough to see the board fixed beside one of the inner bays. Columns of numbers. Allocation codes. Times marked against them. I didn't need to read every line. I recognized the structure of batch movements, schedules, orders. I felt sick. All these years of ledgers, columns, paperwork, it was all so different in person. These were real people, made of flesh and bone, with emotions, with families. Margaret's note had been precise. Before First Light Tuesday. A man nearby turned slightly in my direction and I looked away at once, adjusting my stance as though I had somewhere else to be. I did not belong here. Not yet. I stepped back from the fence and, matching my pace to the movement around me, walked back towards the open yard. When I reached the road I turned, briefly, fixing the place in my mind. Oak Lane Depot. This was where they passed through. Tuesday was when they disappeared. I didn't slow down until the depot was out of sight. I just kept walking. There was no point in standing still and trying to think it through. I did not have enough information. Anything I concluded would be guesswork. Margaret had told me to be there before First Light Tuesday. I didn't know why. She hadn't told me what I was meant to do when I got there. Which meant one of two things. Either she did not know herself, or she expected me to understand something I had not yet seen. I walked on, turning at the first junction that took me away from the main road and back into the narrower service streets that threaded the industrial quarter together. The buildings here were older, some of them empty, their windows boarded or broken. No one paid me any attention. I needed somewhere to stop, not to hide permanently, just somewhere from which I could come and go without being noticed. It needed to be close enough to Oak Lane that I could get back there quickly when the time came. I turned into a yard choked with discarded pallets and rusted drums and crossed to a low building set back from the others. One of the doors had previously been smashed in, it hung precariously from a hinge. I paused, listening, but heard nothing. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The air was stale and felt undisturbed. It appeared to be a storage space, long abandoned. No sound filtered in from outside beyond the distant hum of traffic. This place would do. I closed the door as far as it would go, and putting the bag down, I stood still in the half-dark. Tuesday. Before first light. I sat down and leaned against the back wall. There was nothing I could do about anything except wait. For the first time since the bridge there was no immediate threat, no footsteps closing in, no voices calling out. I closed my eyes, not to sleep but simply to block out the day. But the rush of the morning pressed in regardless, the fall, the water, the cold, the flight. Margaret's note rested against my chest. Oak Lane Depot. Before first light Tuesday. Trust C&L. My body made itself felt soon enough. Even small movements reminded me how unprepared I was for any of this. My shoulders ached, my legs were stiff and unreliable, and there was a deep, persistent tremor that no amount of stillness seemed to ease. I pushed myself upright, knowing that if I remained still too long I would seize up entirely. Moving slowly I tested each joint, each muscle, easing them back into use. I paced the length of the space, back and forth, steadying myself against the wall when necessary. The effort felt absurdly deliberate, as though I were learning again how to inhabit my own body. Gradually the stiffness eased. Blood began to move properly through limbs entirely unaccustomed to such extreme exercise as mine had recently gone through. The trembling finally stopped. Everything about me felt exhausted instead of shocked. I ate a little, carefully rationing what Margaret had left for me, and drank only enough to take the dryness from my throat. My rations would have to last. Time passed. I dozed in short bursts and woke disoriented, expecting the familiar order of my office before reality asserted itself again. I dreamed of ledgers and records and filing cabinets. I didn't leave the building. There was no need and no advantage in breaking from cover. Instead, I used the time to think in a more measured way than I had been able to before. Oak Lane. I replayed what I had seen there, the layout, the flow of people and vehicles, the second line of fencing, the enclosed unit set back from the main yard. It was not a destination but a point of transfer, a place where people were processed and moved on. Margaret had sent me there for a reason and at a specific time, but she had not told me what I was meant to do when I arrived. It was pleasing to think she had enough confidence in me to do the right thing when the time came. I let the question rest. In an odd way, I was enjoying doing absolutely nothing for the first time that I could ever remember. The second day was easier. My body was adjusting to a more active life. I repeated the same slow exercises, paced the room, stretched in every direction I could think of, tried to do some squats. I stopped after one and resolved to try those again tomorrow. I ate less, drank sparingly, and kept track of time as best I could by the changing light. Oddly, I felt I was getting healthier. I thought of Margaret, of the certainty behind her note, of the way she had understood what I had done without needing it explained. She knew me so well. She knew I would not kill myself as a way out and simply leave my family to pick up the pieces. I thought of Caroline and Linda and the fact that all three of them were now ahead of me in whatever this was. The realization unsettled me, but it also gave me something solid to hold on to. I was not acting blindly, even if I did not yet see the whole. However, the thought had arisen that my wife, my daughter, and my granddaughter had been living a life of which I was unaware for some time. A life that ran counter to my life's work. And they hadn't trusted me enough to tell me. Immediately, the thought that balanced that was that they were protecting me by not telling me. I still always ended up thinking that they hadn't trusted me. I had to try not to think it too much before it undermined my self-confidence. Time passed. When the night gave way to the first hint of morning on Tuesday, I gathered the bag, now lighter, and stood for a moment in the half-dark, aware that I was stepping out into a new life. The streets were quiet as I made my way back, the city not yet fully awake. I kept to the routes that offered cover, moving steadily, neither hurrying nor hesitating. I had no intention of drawing attention to myself now. Oak Lane emerged ahead. The depot gate stood open. Inside, the yard was beginning to stir, engines turning over, figures moving between bays, the routine of the place starting up once more. I slowed as I approached. No one looked at me. No one stopped me as I crossed the threshold and entered the yard as though I belonged there. The trick was not to hesitate, to be purposeful. I adjusted my pace to match the movement around me and angled towards the rear of the yard, as though I had somewhere specific to be. A forklift rattled past. 2 men crossed in front of me, arguing over something on a clipboard between them. A van idled near one of the bays, its engine coughing in uneven bursts. It was all noise and motion and routine. I moved past the first row of loading bays and headed towards the secondary fencing. It was higher than the outer boundary, topped with barbed wire. There was a gate set into it, not locked but controlled by a man with a list, calling out names. He ticked them off as people were brought forward. I walked along the line of stacked pallets, keeping them between myself and the more open areas, using them as cover while I took in what was happening. Children were being processed in small groups. Not large enough to cause alarm. Not small enough to be inefficient. The numbers were controlled, matched to whatever capacity lay beyond that fence. Each group was brought forward, checked against the list, counted, and then passed through. There was no resistance. No raised voices. Just compliance, whether willing or enforced I could not yet tell. The guard was clearly following the list he held. That is, name, identifier, allocation code, timing, batch, area, and so on. A format I could have completed in my sleep. Batch movement. The phrase rose up in my mind, sterile and efficient. Seeing it here, in front of me, stripped it of any distance it might once have had. These were not entries on a page. These were people, young people, standing where they were told to stand, moving when they were told to move. It was usually batch movement of goods, rather than humans. Or I had always thought it was. I positioned myself just off to one side of the flow, close enough to observe without obstructing. The guard glanced at me briefly, saw nothing out of place, and returned his attention to his list. Another group was brought forward. Names were called. I found myself following along, matching what I heard to the structure I knew should be there, anticipating the next step before it happened. When the count was completed, I shifted slightly, making space as they were directed through. Sure enough, the gate opened. The group passed beyond the fence. For a moment I could see further in. The enclosed vehicles stood in a row, doors closed, waiting. Beyond them, more movement, more structure, though the details were obscured by distance and angle. The gate closed again. A voice beside me said, "You new on this shift?" I turned just enough to acknowledge him without inviting further scrutiny. "Covering," I said. "Short notice." He nodded, accepting it without question. Of course he did. That was how the system worked. People appeared where they were needed. Gaps were filled. No one asked more than was necessary. "Keep them moving," he said, with a brief gesture towards the line forming again. "We're already behind." "I can see that," I replied. He moved away. The process continued. Names. Counts. Movement. The steady, relentless conversion of people into entries, into numbers, into something that could be moved, allocated, completed. The worst part was that I understood it all. Margaret had been right. I had needed to see this. I had needed to see the real-life consequences of all that pushing paper in the office. As I started to wonder why I was here and if I was in the right place, I felt a shift, a faltering of the rhythm. A very thin man stepped into my path. His gaze went over me once as though I were also a unit of merchandise. "Which unit are you attached to?" he demanded. "Regional adjustment," I said, as though it were obvious. "You've had multiple revisions this morning." I'm smoothing the transfer sequence. The kind of bureaucratic twaddle I had used for years. I haven't seen any notice of that, he said. You wouldn't. It came down late. That's not how it works. No, indeed. I allowed a fraction of impatience tinge my voice. It isn't. But it is how it's working today. He did not like that. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he looked past me towards the bays, as though checking for confirmation. There was none to be had over there. Or anywhere. Around us, the movement continued. Another group was brought forward. A vehicle door slammed. An engine started. If he called it in now? What's your name? He said. I stopped and turned towards him, as though his question was the height of insolence. Do you want the sequence fixed? I asked. Or do you want to spend the next 10 minutes explaining to Central why you stalled 3 lanes over a paperwork lag? He held my gaze. Behind him, someone called out for a count. Another voice answered. Numbers. Movement. Pressure building. You're out of alignment across 2 bays, I went on, quieter now. If you stop it here, you'll have to stop all of it. You know that. He did know it. His attention shifted again, pulled between me and the yard, between the question in front of him and the consequences of asking it properly. The radio at his shoulder crackled. Confirmed discrepancy. He swore softly, irritation overtaking doubt. Just sort it, he said, and turned away. I felt an unexpected, brief, dangerous surge of relief at my successful deception. I wasn't cut out to be James Bond, but maybe I could make a passable sidekick to a rebel. A movement near the inner line caught my attention. A woman stood beside the allocation board, her head slightly bent as though she were checking the figures. Her hair was tied back and her clothing was plain. She fit in with everyone else here. A man approached her, gesticulating, speaking quickly, his irritation clear even from a distance. I could only make out odd words. Something about numbers not matching. She said nothing. Instead, she reached past him and made a small adjustment to the board. It was minimal, a line altered, a mark changed, a number shifted into alignment. He followed the movement of her hand, frowned, and then swore quietly. Fine, he said. Run it. And he turned away. The line began to move again. I remained where I was, watching her. She didn't look up. To anyone else she was simply part of the background, another function within the machinery. But I recognized what I had just seen. Not the gesture itself, but the decision-making behind it. The way she had listened just long enough to understand the problem, then resolved it without discussion, without hesitation, and without seeking approval. I had seen that before. Across a kitchen table, over figures I would dismiss as unimportant, in the quiet competence with which she handled things I had never realized required handling. Linda. My daughter. She was part of this. She was not being moved through it, she was not trapped within it. She was working inside it. At this point I became aware that the very thin man was back. He glared at me. And when he spoke it was not to me, but into his radio. His voice was too low for me to make out the words, but the tone was enough to tell me what he was doing. He was checking I was meant to be there. And, of course, I wasn't.